So we are continuing with the Meet the Meforshim, and I want to welcome you to the fourth week of our series. We're going to discuss tonight Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and he's known as the sweet singer of Israel, and we'll learn hopefully quite a lot about him in the next 55 minutes or so that we have together. Jamie, can I pass that? I'm sorry. The shiur tonight is once again dedicated to the memory of Mordechai ben Harav Menachem Mendel and Liba bat Abba, as well as David Barry's father-in-law, Shmuel ben David. May their memory be for a blessing. So if you make use of the handout that hopefully you have before you, you see that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived from before 1075, and he died, actually I need it myself, in 1141 or so it would seem. In due course, we will consider the circumstances of his death, the place of his death, and his burial, all of which remains a bit obscure. He was born in Tudela, or possibly Toledo. Again, there's uncertainty. Everyone used to say he was born in Toledo, but more recently some have argued persuasively that it was really Tudela. Amen. Before 1075, to a family of high standing. He was born to a family that was wealthy, a family of stature. Remember that this was what became known as the golden age of Spanish Jewry. Some people imagine that it came to an end in 1492. Well, it did come to an end, but that wasn't the golden age. The golden age had long passed before that. The golden age of Hispano-Jewish culture was from around 950 to 1150, about 200 years. And it was not under the Christians, it was primarily under the Muslims. It was Muslim Spain where the Hispano-Jewish culture was able to flourish. This was the time of relative tolerance, of prosperity, of an openness to intellectual currents generally within the Muslim world and within the Jewish world as well. You remember, I hope, that the Muslims conquered Spain or at least Andalusia, the southern part of Spain, in 711. Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar, is named for the general Jabal Abu Tariq. So that became Gibraltar. Jabal means mountain. Abu Tariq, of course, was the Arab conqueror, and they spread Islam by the edge of the sword. The Jews were in Spain already long before that as well, but they suffered grievously under the Visigoths. And there's good reason to think that the Jews probably welcomed the arrival of the Muslims, of the Arabs. It was an improvement for them. Over time, because partly, it's a bit simplistic, but partly because of the distance from Baghdad, from the seat of the Caliphate, they were able in Spain to develop their own more tolerant, more broad-minded, more progressive, more liberal, less fundamental form of Islam. And it flourished. Many cultural, architectural, and some other remnant echoes of that remain in southern Spain, especially even to this day. And under that relatively enlightened Islamic rule, Jewish life also flourished. So we can mention Shmuel HaNagid, we can mention Chasta ibn Shaprut. These are personalities who merged Torah scholarship with prestige, with wealth, with influence, with political positions of authority. Shmuel HaNagid is one of the only Jewish military commanders, probably since biblical times, or maybe since Bar Kokhba, but to oversee a non-Jewish army especially. And he was vizier, he was like the second in command to the to Abd al-Rahman III in Granada, and he was, in that sense, a very influential person. We could tell you more about him, but it's only by way of background, of course, to Yehuda Halevi. Yehuda Halevi was a physician. He also, apparently of high regard, he also pursued business interests, and these multiple talents afforded him ample time for the study of Torah and also for the pursuit, as we shall see, of intellectual and cultural interests. There is some evidence that he studied under the Rif. You may have heard of the Rif, Rav Yitzhak Alfasi. Those who've studied Talmud, you'll find him in the back of the standard edition of the Vilna Talmud. You'll find sort of comments of the Rif. It's more than a commentary, but I have to say that for another time. Those who came with us to Morocco, which is nobody in this room, but we visited Fez, which was the hometown of Rav Yitzhak Alfasi from Fez. Towards the latter part of his life, he moved to Lucena in Spain, and he was immediately accepted as like the Rosh Yeshiva or the Av Bet Din, the leading rabbinic authority. And when he died in 1103, he was succeeded by his disciple Rabbi Yosef ibn Migash, known as the Ri Migash. He's quoted in the commentaries quite a lot, one of the early great Talmudic authorities. And those who have a particular devotion to the writings and the teachings and the legacy of Maimonides may be aware that Rambam praised Ri Migash to the highest heavens. He even implied that Rambam was a disciple of Ri Migash, but it's not really so. Ri Migash was the mentor of the father of the Rambam, of Maimon Avi HaRambam. So we're talking here about great Talmudic personalities whose influence, whose teachings, whose halakhic rulings continue to influence and greatly impact upon Jewish life to this day. Yehuda Halevi was a contemporary of these great figures. Now, I say he may have studied under the Rif. There's no evidence to support that, but we do know that he was a contemporary and an associate of Ri Migash, who, as I said, was a disciple and ultimately a successor of the Rif. So it could well be that he studied under the Rif as well. In terms of the dates, it would work out. He was born around 1075, and as we say, the Rif was the great rabbi there until 1103. And this Lucena, by the way, was like the Gateshead of Spain. It was the town of scholars, of sages, and Yehuda Halevi, who was drawn to the great centers of Torah study, migrated from his hometown to Lucena. When we speak about his, I'm sorry, that's from last week. This is what you need from this week. You know what, I'm going to put this here. So that's for this week if anyone else comes in. Oh, someone will, because we need a minion. Yeah. In terms of his personal life, we actually don't know that much. We know about his personality, as we shall see, from his poems. He was a prolific poet and a very gifted poet. We'll talk about that shortly. But in terms of his own personal life, we have a lot of question marks. So, for example, we don't know anything about his wife. He mentions that he had a daughter and a grandson. Who was his son-in-law? It's not clear. Some have suggested that his son-in-law, now we mentioned last week, someone already astutely recalled the possibility, it may just be a legend, that Ibn Ezra was his son-in-law, Avram ibn Ezra. But there is more reason to think that Yitzchak ibn Ezra, Yitzchak ben Avraham ibn Ezra, was his son-in-law. And remember that we said that Ibn Ezra had a number of sons, 5 sons, but 4 of them died before they grew to adulthood, and the one of which we know for certain, Yitzchak, actually had quite a checkered career as well. So he may have become the son-in-law of Yehuda Halevi. It seems that he traveled with Yehuda Halevi towards the end of the life of Yehuda Halevi to Egypt, and we'll talk about that shortly. We know of this association from the Cairo Geniza. There has a lot of information about Yehuda Halevi, and especially his sojourn in Egypt, which we'll get to, emerged from documents recovered in the famous Cairo Geniza. And this is one detail of that as well, about Yitzchak ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra apparently must have moved on to Baghdad subsequently, and we mentioned what became of him there. It wasn't such a happy story. He was a poet. Yehuda Halevi, as we mentioned, was a poet. And it's important to realize that in that time and place, poetry was not just a pursuit, like a kind of niche interest for more artsy types of people. It was a vehicle for culture, for entertainment, for celebrity, for fame, for prestige. It merged like a pop star, an artist, a writer, and a scholar, all merged in one. Remember that the Muslims did not believe...
So did he write any piyutim?
He wrote lots of piyutim. He wrote more than 300 piyutim, which are recited in synagogues to this day all over the world. Even in his lifetime, it stretches as far as India. We have sidurim and machzorim from India that include his poems. They were incorporated into the liturgy. He wrote Zimirot that we sing on Shabbos. Does anybody know which Zemer he wrote? One of the well-known Zimirot.
Ani Zimirot?
No. Ani Zimirot we're going to talk about next week when we do Yehuda HaChassid. As Zemer that we sing at the Shabbos table. Not everyone sings it, but it's in your Zimirot's book. If it's not in your Zimirot's book, then ask for a refund. Go back to the wedding and say, hey, you've got to hand out better Zimirot's books at your wedding. No, it's in all of them. That's it. Yom Shabbason, Ein Ishkoach. So that Zemer, the acrostic spells out Yehuda, and it was written by Yehuda Halevi. Yeah. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Don't get me off the track, though. I want to help you understand the significance of being a poet. The Muslims did not cultivate art. They didn't believe in art very much. Art in the sense of portraits. That's strictly haram. Asked the hapless cartoonist in Denmark a few years ago. See what happened to them. So the form of art that they cultivated was primarily calligraphy. And calligraphy and poetry go together because a poem needs to look beautiful as well. And they, of course, they didn't have technology in those days to record music. So music was either with musical instruments, which was live, or poems that could be recited, that could be chanted. And to compose a poem, Islam prided itself and continues to pride itself on the beauty and the supple nature of the Arabic language. So for the Muslims, the fact that in Arabic one can compose the most beautiful, inspiring, lyrical poetry was part of the proof of the divinity of the Quran.
Did they write down the musical notes? That's how
sometimes I think there is a tradition about some of the musical notes, but primarily they didn't. Primarily it was just the words. But the words followed a very well-defined meter and that sort of thing. Maybe this is the time to just distribute some of these books. So this is called the New Hebrew School of Poets. I don't know why it's called new, because these are all medieval. And this book itself was published probably, let me just see, about 100 years ago, 1906. It was published in 1906. And at that time, there was a lot of interest among the Wissenschaft school about Hebrew poems, but I'm talking about from medieval times. You can just leaf through that. This is a whole book of the poetry of Yehuda Halevi with English translation. Again, published probably 70, 80 years ago. This is a reprint, but it was first published a long time ago. And this book, so this is specifically Yehuda Halevi. The other book has a lot of poets, Yehuda Halevi prominent among them. And this is a modern, more recent publication, The Gazelle, Medieval Hebrew Poems on God, Israel, and the Soul, by Raymond Shanley, his contemporary scholar. A beautiful book, very, very, the translations are very inspiring here. If you want to look through it. The same author wrote another book about medieval Hebrew poems called Wine, Women, and Death, which is about like what we call Shirei Chol, secular Hebrew poetry. And this is about the soul and Israel, more religious Hebrew poetry. So what I want to emphasize, though, is that for Yehuda Halevi and his culture, in his time and place, poetry was the vehicle for expressing profound ideas, sublime ideas. It was a vehicle for ruminations on life, on philosophy, on the soul, and therefore the sort of celebrity status in those days came from poetry. And as a poet, he was extremely gifted, And he traveled, we're looking at Roman numeral 2, letter A. He traveled in Andalusia and he stayed in Granada with Moshe ibn Ezra. Moshe ibn Ezra was, I think, well, he's maybe a cousin of the famous Avram ibn Ezra. He definitely was related. He was not a brother, but he was a cousin or an uncle. I don't know if the relationship is even certain, but he definitely was related. And he was a famous poet, this Moshe ibn Ezra, who was older than Yehuda Halevi. And Yehuda Halevi migrated from Christian Spain to Muslim Spain. And he won a poetry competition. It was like Britain's Got Talent, in Cordoba. And all of the great poets would come to recite it. And he won because he adapted a famous poem by Moses ibn Ezra. And he kind of innovated in it. And he won the competition. And because of that, he was a celebrity. And this Moshe ibn Ezra invited him to stay with him, which he did for a time in Granada. Now, Yehuda Halevi, because of his talent, because of his stature, meaning he came from a wealthy family, because of his education, he was an educated man, as he was a physician, because of his charismatic personality, so he naturally gravitated towards the aristocratic circles, and his poems in this stage of his life were about wine, love, the good life. His poems were about friendship, and these sorts of general subjects. And he achieved great prestige and great renown. Also riddles.
Would Rabbi Yehuda Levi's poetry have been in Arabic or in Hebrew?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you for prompting me on that. So Yehuda Halevi, together with essentially all of the Jewish writers and scholars of the time, they wrote predominantly in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. However, poetry was the exception. They never wrote poetry in Arabic because, as I mentioned earlier, the Muslims cited the beauty of the Arabic language as proof for the Quran. In order to compete, they wanted to show Hebrew is just as supple, just as beautiful, just as sublime, just as eloquent, just as profound. And therefore, they would never write poetry. When I say never, there are very, very few examples of Jewish poets who wrote poetry in Arabic. They wrote everything else in Arabic, including Torah commentaries, including, I'm sure you know, the Rambam wrote Moreh Nevuchim and his commentary on the Mishnah in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic. But poetry they always wrote in Hebrew.
Did he write in Spanish?
No. I don't think Ladino was well developed at that time. No, he probably spoke Spanish because he lived in Christian Spain, but he lived most of his life in Muslim Spain. So he would have spoken Arabic very fluently. Arabic was probably his mother tongue. But he was clearly very proficient in Hebrew, certainly very proficient in Hebrew, and his poems were all specifically in Hebrew. And this is true for all the Hebrew poets of the age.
How did that help him with the stature of the situation in Spain if everyone, presumably the aristocrats were Muslim?
That's true. That's true. But some of the aristocrats were Jewish as well. And it was a time. I said it was the so-called golden age of the Spanish Jewry, when the interaction with the Muslims, especially at the higher echelons, was quite sort of friendly. There was a lot of interaction. There was still hostility as well. And actually, when we look at some of those poems, some of the Shirei Chol, the secular poems, we find a lot of tension sometimes in which the poet, the Hebrew poet, will describe the good life, wine and song and poetry and the plashing of the fountains and the chirping of the birds and the beautiful scenery and the garden experience and the wonderful food. And then he will express some guilt about how can I be so relaxed and so comfortable and so happy when the temple is in ruins, when we're in exile, when we are dominated by a foreign nation. So there was some of that angst, some of that, like you could say, cognitive dissonance. But many Jews were quite successful and quite comfortable there in Spain. And I would say that Yehuda Halevi probably was one of them. But if you look in Roman numeral 2 letter C, he may well have had a religious awakening at a certain time. And there are some theories as to what brought it about. It may have been angst because of the First Crusade. The First Crusades took place in 1096. And although that did not directly affect the Jews in Muslim Spain, but they would have heard about it. And it could be he felt, it's wrong for me to be living the good life here among the Muslims in Andalusia, where the sun is always shining, and we're eating those lovely oranges that you get on holiday when you go to the Costa del Sol and all of that. But maybe I'm neglecting, or maybe I'm almost betraying my Jewish responsibilities. So that may have been a factor. And he expresses his regret for writing the Shirei Chol of his youth. Some have pointed out that many of his so-called secular poems are also suffused with religious sensibility. Even though they might not explicitly be describing religious themes, but one sees his sensitivity and his recognition of religious sensibilities that also are to be found within those poems. Some have suggested that he was disillusioned by the murder of his patron, who was a courtier of Alfonso VI, and in 1108. His patron was murdered, and he may have realized that, things are not so wonderful here in Spain after all. And that was in 1108. And from there he made his way to Andalus, and again back, because he went back and forth many times. It's hard to know exactly where he was, and in what sequence. But there's evidence that he was sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south. But as the 12th century progressed, the campaign of the reconquest, in which Spain, which was overrun by the Muslims, as I said, starting in 711, and they pushed all the way to the north, but in the subsequent generations and centuries, the Christians pushed back further and further. And the religious wars, the tension, it began to characterize the age, and the tension and the instability and the fact that the Christians were hostile to the Jews, and the Muslims also, he didn't know how long the good times would last. And one senses when you read some of his later poems that he felt as if the good times may be coming to an end, and his consciousness of the exile comes to the fore. So if we look at letter D, his religious poetry, so I've mentioned already Yom Shabbaton, which we sing at Shalasuda sometimes, and we said the acronym there is Yehuda. Another famous song, of which he has several that are in this genre, but one of the very famous ones is called Tzion Haloti Shali Lishlom Asirayach. It's even put to music. Tzion, Tzion, Tzion Haloti Shali Lishlom Asirayach. So this is the title, the first stanza of a long poem, and actually we say it, Ashkenazim, we say it, even though he was Sephardi, we say it on Tisha B'Av. It's one of the dirges, one of the laments, one of the keynotes that we recite in recalling the exile, and that was written by Yehuda Halevi around 1130, when, as I said, the religious wars and fundamentalism was increasing as well. It was in 1135 that the Almoravides spread a much more fundamentalist form of Islam, but in 1148 it got much worse, and that is when the Almohades, for those who came with us to Marrakesh, which is is Yaakov, came with us to Marrakesh. So our tour guide was a lovely guy, a wonderful, big, tall, black Muslim Berber, very much a Philo-Semite, a lovely guy. I think Yaakov would agree. We got along like a house on fire. But his knowledge of Jewish history, while quite impressive, all things considered, wasn't so thorough. And he was showing us the great mosque, was at the time was the largest mosque, I think, in Africa, or maybe the second largest in the world, that was begun by this Almohades, caliph. And he was saying that Almohades, they were a great empire, but for us, they were misery. They spread Islam by the edge of the sword, and they spread a totally intolerant, violent form of Islam. And that's why Rambam, who we'll talk about in due course, not tonight, coming weeks, he fled his own hometown in 1149 because of the arrival of the Almohades. But already a decade or two before that, you could say, to borrow a biblical metaphor, the writing was on the wall. Where does that come from? Who knows? The book of Daniel. Daniel has got it. That's got the right name for it. Yeah. That he could see the writing was on the wall. So around 1130 already he began to think and to write about maybe life in Spain is not so wonderful after all. What do you say, Daniel?
Yeah, it's interesting because historically isn't that really what's occurring now? I mean,
Yes.
Back to what the
Yes.
liberation and
Yes.
ISIS and so forth, more militant sons. So really, there's repeats of
That's true.
cycles.
That's true. How true it is. How true it is. Finally, in number 3, religious poems found in liturgy throughout the Jewish world as far away as India, which we mentioned already. And then in E, he is remembered as the greatest of the Hebrew poets of the golden age of Hispano-Jewish culture. And we mentioned already that the cultivation of Lashon HaKodesh, of the Hebrew language for poetry, was a mark of Jewish pride, and it was an indication of how the Jews felt that we can compete in terms of linguistically and from a literary standpoint as well. And but some have wondered, you might say, from the position of like Rabbi Yehuda HaChassi, that we'll speak about next week, from the point of view of the Ashkenazim, they might say, yeah, okay, Jewish pride, but aren't they just mimicking the Arabs? At the end of the day, it's kind of any get your gun. Anything you can do, I can do better. So the Muslims have beautiful Arabic poetry. Well, we'll show you we can have beautiful Hebrew poetry. But from the position of the Balei Tosfos, they might say, why are you wasting your time on poetry? I mean, you should be studying Torah. And Yehuda Halevi himself may have had such a thought in his own mind, because we find, and this is what I'd like to turn to now, that he developed very much as a philosopher, as a religious philosopher, and he wrote the book, the famous book for which he is always remembered, which is called Kuzari, and the subtitle is important, In Defense of the Despised Faith. And it was translated into Hebrew by Yehud ibn Tibon in the middle of the 12th century, and has subsequently been translated into many other languages. And I have right here several translations. So this is the original English translation that I used when I was in graduate school. You can see it's well used, this book. It's got no covers even, and it's annotated, and I can't say I remember that much of it, but I did study it. And so this was translated by someone called Hartwig. It was translated by Hartwig Hirschfeld, who translated it from the original Arabic as well, actually, into English. I think he published an Arabic edition and also in this English translation, but this was first published in 1905. So it's quite old, and the English naturally reflects that. That was the classic for a long time. It's been translated into Hebrew, a much more modern, accessible translation by this Yehuda Even Shmuel, probably was translated about 50 years ago. And I bought this one for the Hebrew when I was in graduate school. And in some cases, the Hebrew is a bit easier to understand than the English, and this English is so archaic. The only thing is that this Hebrew translation has been criticized for being too dumbed down and not always faithful to, when I say dumbed down, too simplified, too colloquial, and actually is not always faithful to the original. So a very great scholar who was a fluent Arabic speaker and a scholar of Arabic as well, called Yosef Kafach, who who died about 10 or 15 years ago, translated the Kuzari into Hebrew again. It's not what I would call a modern, accessible Hebrew, but he claims it's more accurate than the other Hebrew translations which are around, and he has actually published it with the Hebrew and the Arabic in the facing column. I have to say the Arabic is lost on me, but the Hebrew I can just about understand. So I'll pass that one around as well if you want to see it. But the best one is this one, the Kuzari in Defense of the Despised Faith, which is translated more recently. I mean, you can just see at a glance, it's a recent production by a man called Rabbi Daniel Korobkin. He's a rabbi in Toronto. He's originally from Los Angeles. And this is a wonderful edition. It's translated. The Hebrew is the original Ibn Tibon Hebrew, which is quite a difficult Hebrew. But the English is a very excellent English translation with footnotes and appendices also. And this is available. It's published by Feldheim, and it's in print. And if you're interested in Kuzari, or even if you just want to have a very useful reference book for your collection, I can recommend this one. Maybe I'll pass this right the other way.
Was it written originally in Arabic?
Oh yes.
Yeah, so
Oh yes.
Can we be certain then that the translations are accurate? Or
If you use this translation, if you use the Kafech, then you can be certain that it is, because Kafech, Yosef Kafech, Azeru died only within about 10, 15 years ago, was a scholar. He was Taimani, he was born in Yemen, and he was a scholar. He was a proper scholar, not just something that he learned as a child, which he did as well, but he was a proper scholar. And that translation is possibly better than the Ibn Tibon, the medieval translation. Now, I'm not sure if Korobkin had use of this. I think he did. I think Korobkin says that he used the Kafek translation for the Arabic into the Hebrew. Of course, if you want to be a real scholar, yes, you'll learn the Judeo-Arabic and you'll study it for yourself. Yeah. Nerida, maybe your mom can help us, can't she? Yeah, a bit of Arabic? She could? Okay, well, there you have it. Nerida can get her mom on the case if your Judeo-Arabic is a bit rusty, she'll help you out. Okay. So this is the great book Kuzari. What was great about it? So the fascinating thing is, and you probably possibly know this, it was inspired by the story of Bulan and the letters of Chastai. Who was Bulan? Bulan was the king of the Khazars, and he lived in the 9th century. We don't really know exactly when he lived or where he lived. We do know he existed. And what is fascinating and extraordinary about this King Bulan is that he was a pagan, but he became a Jew. He converted to Judaism. And I say all, probably not all, but many of his subjects converted to Judaism. And the Khazar kingdom did exist in the 9th century, in the 10th century, and it was primitive. Even historically, the evidence for it is not that extensive. They were not like great scholars who left a lot of literary evidence of their existence, but they did exist. And this story greatly fascinated Chasta ibn Shaprut, who undertook a correspondence with Joseph, who was apparently a descendant of the King Bulan, Joseph, king of the Khazars, and Chasta ibn Shaprut yearned to learn about this Jewish tribe that lives not under foreign domination, not at the pleasure of the Muslims or at the grudging, I won't say even pleasure, but the grudging tolerance or persecution of the Christians, but they live free in their own land, even though it's not the land of Israel, but at least they live freely. Now, how learned they were, did they have rabbis, etc., I don't know. It was probably quite a primitive, simplistic form of Judaism, but they did profess the Jewish faith. So Yehuda Halevi, who lived like a couple of hundred years after this King Bulan, used as a literary device the invitation of the king to, so he puts it like this, that the king had a dream, and in the dream, a prophet or an angel or God himself told him, your intent is worthy, but your actions are not. Meaning your aspirations are praiseworthy, but your form of religious service is degenerate. That's what was the dream. So he decided, it's true, I want to serve God, but this kind of crass paganism that everybody does around here, there must be something better. So he invited, and again, it's hard to know how much of this is truthful. Probably not. I mean, it is true that the king converted to Judaism. How it came about, difficult to know and probably impossible to know. But Yehuda Halevi, in his imagination, says that the king, this Khazar king, had a dream, etc. And he invited he invited a Muslim and a Christian and a philosopher, an Aristotelian philosopher, to express their view of the world and of the universe and of the soul and how to serve God. Well, he first quickly discovered that the Christian and the Muslim disagree with one another on a lot of things, but they both emerged from Judaism. So he thought, Goyish Cup, I need a Jewish guy here. So he gets a rabbi, and then he sends the philosopher home as well. He's not persuaded by the philosopher, and he keeps the rabbi around. And he asks the rabbi a whole series of questions. And that makes up the book Kuzari. So it's a literary device. He wasn't trying to deceive his readers as if this were actually a historical account of what happened. It was based, though, on this Khazar king, and that's how it became known as the Kuzari, because the book unfolds through the questions of the king and the answers of the rabbi. And Yehuda Halevi puts into the mouth of the king intelligent, searching questions. And this serves as a vehicle for him to develop a full religious philosophy. So that is the fascinating background. And by the way, in this edition, there's an appendix in which you can read the letters of Chasta ibn Shaprut to the king of the Khazars, which was about 100 years, or maybe 200 years, 50 years after the original, this king Bulan. But those letters have survived. Some have questioned their authenticity, but most scholars believe they are authentic. Those letters are authentic. Chastai sent a letter from Cordoba to wherever they were in Caesarea, and that whole story, fascinating story about how the letters eventually were delivered, and then he responded, the whole correspondence. Okay, but that's just the background to Sefer Kuzari. Now, so those are the general observations about the clever literary device. And I'd like to now take the chance, in the time we have left, to look at a few interesting and influential passages from the Sefer Kuzari, which you should find on the reverse of your handout. So one of them, and this is a very famous, very important one, is the truth of the Torah, revelation experienced by millions of people. And actually, I see I don't even have it here for you. It's a bit long, that's why. But it's in book 1, it's chapters 80 to 89. But I will tell you about it because it's very influential. Of course, the Muslim and the Christian scholar, they both claim revelation. They both claim that God revealed himself to the prophet or communicated to the people in this way. And the king realizes that there's a weakness in both of these accounts, because Muhammad had his great revelation in the desert. Nobody was there to witness it, and he could have just made it up. Jesus, I don't say lahavdil, he's not, he's in the same category as Muhammad as far as I'm concerned. And he also had an account of revelation and all of that, which was witnessed by a small group of people. Judaism, by contrast, claims that the revelation on Har Sinai, which we are going to celebrate in a few days' time, was experienced by many hundreds of thousands of people. Now, he explains, it's not just the audacity of the claim that it was experienced by hundreds of thousands of people, but it's what I like to call the fallacy of the first fool. Because if a person is going to claim that God appeared to him and told him this and this, he might be able to persuade people about it. If they're gullible or he's very charismatic. But would he be able to persuade an entire population that this event happened to their ancestors, but their ancestors never told them about it, and he is the only one to tell them about what happened to their ancestors? They would say, well, if it happened to my grandparents, they would have told me about it. And even if it was 1,000 years ago, but I would have heard such an event. It would have been transmitted. There would be a record of it. There would be an oral trend. The story would have been repeated generation after generation. So Yehuda Halevi says that it would be absurd for an entire generation to believe that an event happened to their ancestors, but nobody ever knew about it. No one ever told anyone about it. It could only be accepted and regarded as truthful if it indeed occurred to that whole generation. The difference with Christianity and Islam is that it rests on a slender basis of just one person or a handful of people. So this is Yehuda Halevi's famous proof of the truth of the Torah, revelation experienced by millions. But in a more subtle way, and this is number 2 here, revealed faith is superior to demonstrated faith. I said before that Yehuda Halevi had what some have described as a religious awakening. Now, he was a sophisticated philosopher, but he was a philosopher who believed that we do not need to rely on the Greek principles. We don't need to rely on the teachings of Aristotle, which at that time was pervasive in the intellectual currents throughout the Muslim world for certain. And he felt very much that religion is never dependent on philosophical reasoning. Philosophical reasoning has its place, and let's say rational analysis, intellectual acumen has its place. But, and this is how I've summed it up in a few words, revealed faith is superior to demonstrated faith. Revealed faith is, I know what God wants because it's written in the Torah. Demonstrated faith is, I can prove that it's moral or ethical to do this and this, or it's abhorrent to act in this particular way, or God must exist because of the following, let's say, intellectual argument or astronomical argument and that sort of thing. So Yehuda Halevi said, yeah, that may be so, but maybe another person will come along and challenge that, or maybe someone who is not, let's say, a philosopher, he doesn't have that kind of intellectual acumen, will say, well, I don't understand this, so I don't believe in God. Says Yehuda Halevi, if you rely on revealed faith, what you learned from your parents, from your teachers, what's handed down generation after generation, that is better, that's more compelling, and that's more truthful ultimately. So, take a look, if you turn the page over now, at the long column on the left-hand side. No, I'm sorry. At the upper right. 226. No, it's, yeah. Yes. So here, Yehuda Halevi writes as follows. Let's look in the English just for simplicity's sake. All was done with order and planned with divine wisdom. I do not declare, heaven forbid, that the absolute intention of the sacrificial order was as I have described it. Now I need to give a bit of background. The king has asked Yehuda Halevi, the king has asked the rabbi in the literary device of Yehuda Halevi about the sacrifices, the whole sacrificial system, which is very complicated and quite abstruse, quite distant from our experience, and takes up a lot of the book of Vayikra. What's the purpose of it? What's the symbolism? What's the significance? So the rabbi indulges in an extensive explanation with a lot of symbolism and that sort of thing. But then at the end, and this is what's significant for us, at the end he says, I don't mean to say that I am actually explaining to you the true ultimate reason why God has commanded us. He says, heaven forbid that the absolute intention of the sacrificial order was as I've described. The intention was actually more wondrous and lofty. After all, the sacrificial order is part of God's Torah, and one who accepts the Torah completely without first rationalizing it with his intellect is greater than one who rationalizes and investigates everything. Now we shall see that the Rambam disagrees with that. The Rambam, Maimonides, takes issue with that way of thinking, and so does Rabbeinu Bechaya ibn Pakuda in Chovos Halevavos. But Yehuda Halevi stands strong. and stands tall. And he is quite certain, and he repeats it in different ways in other parts of the book. He says that one who rationalizes and investigates everything is inferior. You're better off if you accept it by the tradition. Nevertheless, one who descends from that high level and seeks to understand reasons is better off basing his explanations on accurate wisdom than forsaking them for poor interpretations and questions which lead to spiritual destruction. So he is of the view that Judaism is not constrained by the limitations of Greek, that is to say Arabic philosophy, and in this regard he takes issue with Saadia Gaon, he takes issue with Rabbeinu Bechaya, and he'll later, as I say, stand in contrast to the view of the Rambam. Take a look at the lower right-hand corner now. Fast and Feast is one of my favorite passages. So I wonder if this, and I hope I'm not sort of out on a skating on thin ice here, if I suggest that there may be an echo of some of his laudatory poems of the good life, where he was luxuriating, as I said, in the chirping of the birds and the plashing of the fountains and the beauty of the flowers and the aroma of the fruits and the garden. Maybe there's an echo of that here in this passage. The rabbi says the divine law imposes no asceticism on us. It rather desires that we should keep the equipoise and grant every mental and physical faculty its due, as much as it can bear, without overburdening one faculty at the expense of another. So he here is saying that we don't believe in long fast or frequent fast. We do have a long fast on Yom Kippur, but we don't have a whole lot of them. And he probably was very conscious that the Muslims, they fast the whole month of Ramadan. I think they just finished, or maybe not yet. Even.
Yes, that's right.
Tomorrow. Well, there you have it. Okay, party time. And the Catholics fast a lot. So he says we don't believe in lots of fast and abstentions and asceticism. If a person gives way to licentiousness, he blunts his mental faculty. He who is inclined to violence injures some other faculty. Prolonged fasting is no act of piety for a weak person. For him, feasting is a burden and self-denial. But he goes on to say, just to skip where it's underlined, our law as a whole is divided between fear, love, and joy. And he says we need the balance among those, by each of which one can approach God. Thy contrition on a fast day does nothing the nearer to God than thy joy on the Sabbath and holy days, if it is the outcome of a devout heart. Or to put it in other language, one who celebrates and delights in Shabbos and the festivals will draw close to God in just as an effective manner as one who fasts and deprives himself of physical pleasures. So again, it's that balance, and as I say, maybe there's an echo here of his appreciation of the good life. The left-hand column there we won't do at length, but here you see a very beautiful passage, albeit the translation I've provided here is the old archaic one, but a beautiful passage in which the rabbi is actually like stumped by the king. The king asks him a question, challenges him, and the rabbi has no riposte. The challenge is, if your siddur and your prayers and your thoughts and your Torah place the land of Israel at the center of Jewish life, and you pray for the return to Zion, and your whole liturgy revolves around the agricultural cycle in the land of Israel, like we pray for rain in the winter because that's when it rains in the land of Israel, etc., then why have you neglected the land of Israel? Why have you abandoned it? Why don't you go there? And why don't you seek to resettle the land of Israel? That's what the king asks the rabbi. And the rabbi says, just look at the last lines, if we say worship his holy hill, worship at his footstool, he who restores his glory to Zion. In other words, this is but as the chattering of the starling and the nightingale. We do not realize what we say by this sentence, nor others, as thou rightly observest, O Prince of the Khazars. In other words, Yehuda Halevi here gives expression to his own longing for Zion. And this and similar passages help to explain why Sefer Kuzari is very popular in religious Zionist or nationalist religious circles, because there's a strong emphasis on Jewish peoplehood, on nationalism, l'umiyut, and especially on the centrality of the land of Israel. And as you may know, Yehuda Halevi did not only talk the talk, but he walked the walk as well. And possibly because he saw that things were not as wonderful in Spain as they had been maybe in the past, or as we might imagine that we'd like them to be. And because he developed this idea of the centrality of the land of Israel, so he decided to travel to the land of Israel. And towards the end of his life, he set out, well, it would actually prove to be very near the end of his life, he set out for Eretz Israel. Why? Why did he do it? It was very rare. In this early time, this is long before, of course, long before political Zionism, but it was long before the disciples of the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov went to the land of Israel in the late 1700s. This was long before even the Spanish exiles made their way, like to Tzfat or the other holy cities. This was very early in the relatively, let's say, early in the post-exile era. Yehuda Halevi set out for the land of Israel. By the way, Ramban, we'll find, also left for the land of Israel. So why did Yehuda Halevi go? So no doubt, part of it was, like we just said, his love of Eretz Israel. The second, I think, is his personal piety. As we've seen, he had the soul of a poet. He had the mind of a scholar. He had the heart of a devout servant of Hashem. And even as a philosopher, he was very staunch in his insistence that faith is stronger than philosophical syllogisms. So a person of that level of piety probably yearned to escape the influence of the exile and the foreign domination. And of course he realized, as we all realize, that at least in principle, the land of Israel is the place where a person's spirit will soar. I say in principle because it doesn't necessarily apply to every single person at every time, but no doubt that was part of the attraction for him, doubtless. Also, we mentioned the uncertainties of the time. The Reconquista was underway, the waning of Muslim tolerance, and we mentioned already the Almohades and all of that. Okay, so he set out for the land of Israel. Well, they didn't have flights, from Madrid to Tel Aviv in those days. So he had to take a boat bound for Alexandria of Egypt. And he arrived in Alexandria on the 8th of September, 1140. We happen to know because of the Cairo Geniza, because a lot of details of his sojourn there are recorded. From there, he was met with great fanfare. His prestige and his esteem had preceded him, and people went to greet him and to welcome him. And from Alexandria, he went to Cairo, where they wanted him to stay. They wanted him to come to be the rabbi or the scholar in residence or something like that. And he wrote a lot of poems there. Some have said even he may have had like an Indian summer in which he recovered some of the love of his youth. And apparently he wrote a poem there in praise of some of the wine, women, and song kind of themes. But in the end, he decided, no, he's come on this journey for the land of Israel. He returned to Alexandria, and he set sail for the land of Israel on the 14th of May, 1141. Or, let's say he boarded the ship. It seems that there was inclement weather, which is a bit odd because the 14th of May, you wouldn't expect inclement weather in Egypt, but that seems to be the case, or maybe the boat needed some servicing or something. It's not clear if the boat ever sailed. Some say that he ended up in Egypt and he died in Egypt and he's buried somewhere in Alexandria, we don't know where. Some question whether he ever made his way to Eretz Israel. Some say that he eventually, and this is hard to understand geographically, how he ended up in Aleppo, I think, or something like that. Difficult to understand why he would bypass the land of Israel. We don't really know what became of him. But you probably know about the legend. If not, maybe that's why you're here. The legend, which is first recorded in the 15th century and has been reprinted many times, is that he did make his way to Akko, to the port of Akko, which is next to, do you know where? Next to Haifa, next to Haifa. Yeah. Akko is the ancient city, Haifa is the modern city. So Akko, and he dismounted there. Some say it was there that he knelt to the ground to kiss the land of Eretz Israel. Some say he made it to Jerusalem, and he did the same to kiss the holy stones of Jerusalem, and he was trampled by an Arab horseman, and he died a few days later. Now, one reason to question that is that Jerusalem was under Crusader domination at that time rather than the Arab domination, but there could have been a Christian crusader who trampled him. We don't really have historical evidence to substantiate that account, but we don't have any evidence of any other sort to explain what became of him when he died. It is assumed that he died in 1141 because we don't have any more poems that he wrote or anything else, but where he's buried is uncertain. And as I say, this is the legend of his death, of Yehuda Halevi. Just influence and legacy of Yehuda Halevi. He remains one of the romantic heroes because of his beautiful poetry, because of his mastery of the Hebrew language, because of his beautiful Shirei Chol on the good life, and of course his many piyutim, zemirot, Shirei Kodesh that he wrote as well, because of the philosophical work that he has penned, and it's acquired contemporary resonance with the return of the Jewish people to their land. And as we have seen, even in the short passage that we only looked at part of, you can read the rest at your leisure, and elsewhere in his book, he had a great love of the land of Israel, and his writings serve as a strong part of the intellectual basis, the philosophical basis for the religious Zionist enterprise as a whole. So these are some thoughts. Thank you for listening on Yehuda Halevi. Next week we're going to do a different Yehuda, a very different Yehuda, Yehuda HaChasid. And please come back next week to learn all about him. Very different personality, very great personality, and very influential personality, possibly more influential than we realized. But next week, you'll realize why he's influential. Thank you very much.